I want to introduce you to Steve Kirk. He is a dear colleague and friend at this point. We've worked on a couple things together. Steve works for the Nature Conservancy, and your title is kind of a misnomer, Steve, I think, right? Because it says, are you a coastal manager? But in reality, why don't you tell us what a lot of your day is made up of? That would be great to get.
Yeah, I mean, my hi everybody, glad to be here. Thanks, Jen and Seth, for having me join your class. It's great. Yeah, my title is Coastal Program Manager for TNC in Massachusetts, and it's sort of like a catch-all term that it's hard to know what the title really means. You know, my day-to-day these days is sitting in this spare bedroom in my house. But yeah, you know, I can give you a sense of what TNC's aquaculture program sort of broadly entails, and some things that are focused here in Massachusetts. And I don't know, I suppose it'd probably be just easier to go right into sort of presentation if that's good with you, Jen, Seth, and everybody else.
That'd be great.
Cool. Yeah, well, so I have a set of slides that'll help remind me what to talk about, and so I'll share my screen. My name's Steve Kirk. I'm the Coastal Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy, and I guess to like step way back and right to the top, the Nature Conservancy is a environmental conservation organization. If you're not familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we have offices in all of the 50 states and in over 70 countries. The mission of the organization is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. It's a big mission, and it touches down a lot of different places in different ways. And you know, I think while the mission is a bit daunting on the day-to-day, in sort of keeping with introducing the organization, the vision of the organization is to create a world where people and nature thrive. And I think that this space in aquaculture is an interesting sort of manifestation of how I think in part we can actually work toward that. And it's interesting. You think about some of the environmental challenges that we're facing sort of across the board, and the way that we humans produce food has significant impact on the planet, and that's sort of across the board. And so here we are, an environmental conservation organization that is working more in the aquaculture space, and I think we're doing that in a way that's a bit different than environmental organizations have in the past. You know, in the past, I think there's and for good reason, because like it's not like all aquaculture all the time is good, but there's you know, there have been a lot of campaigns and efforts on the backs of environmental organizations that are sort of looking to make aquaculture either go away or make it less bad, and that's because of this persistent narrative. You know, it's like aquaculture is a net, you know, negative to the environment, so we should be doing less of it. Or if you're going to do it, well, we're going to try to make it, you know, hard or make it, you know, so that it's less damaging to the environment. And there's, you know, again, I think there's a place for that. When we sort of step back and think about, again, the impacts of the production of food on the planet, you know, I think that there's a lot to be said for producing food in a way that takes less resources. And, you know, I'm not going to talk a lot about this. Most of the work that I work on is not based around finfish, but more shellfish and a little bit of seaweed. So we'll talk a bit about that. But I think sort of looking at the big picture, it's important to think about, you know, how we're going to survive on the planet with whatever it's going to be, 10 billion people before too long, and the food that we eat is going to have a big impact on that. So, and also in the aquaculture space, that, and maybe you have seen this, I'm not sure, but the data is showing that aquaculture, the fastest growing form of food production on the planet, and is forecast to continue to grow. And how that fits in with seafood globally, it's a real player. That is seafood. 3 billion people rely on seafood as their primary protein source, and coming down the line, that's not going to come from wild capture fisheries. We're not sort of against wild capture fisheries either. I think there's an important role for fishing communities and for the seafood that they produce. But this is an aquaculture class, so that's what we're talking about. So I think that, thinking about this big vision of the organization, people and nature thriving, we're sort of approaching this like aquaculture as a tool to grow food. But then I think there's also sort of another element of how different aquaculture businesses, farms, and practices interact with the marine environment. And we as a conservation organization are keenly interested to really understand what the implications for the environment the farm has. And so I used to have a small oyster farm in Falmouth, sort of nearby where Seth's is generally. And I will tell you that when I used to pick up my gear and cages, that we would see, the farm seemed as though it was like teeming with life. I mean, there were juvenile lobsters and fish swimming out of the cages, and all of the encrusting organisms and the fouling organisms, and just sort of like, if you were going to throw a Volkswagen in the water, you would get fish to swim to it, and you would, create structured habitat, which the coastal waters need. And so, by having the farm here, I'm sort of skipping ahead a little bit to a specific project that we're doing. It's really trying to understand how the farm interacts with the marine environment. We're interested in that sort of element, and we're interested in that element because our estuaries and coastal waters are incredibly valuable. They're the places where the vast majority, I think the statistic is something on the order north of 70% of all the commercially important fish species spend a portion of their life cycle in our estuaries. And that's sort of one statistic showing the importance that's relevant to the seafood discussion, that that estuaries are important, and that oysters and their habitat, other shellfish species play an important role in the functioning of estuaries and coastal waters. And for the most part, they're gone. And that's due to, disease, shellfish disease. It's due to land-based practices, and that's led to poor water quality, poor functional habitat. We eat them and we have overfished them, and not only from just removing them, but damaging the habitat that goes along with them are all the stressors for why many native shellfish species are gone or greatly reduced from our area and others. And so the sort of simple response to that is to say, well, we can put the habitat back and we can put the shellfish back, and we do that to some degree. I mean, here in Massachusetts, we've done that on a pretty small scale, where the sort of basics of shellfish habitat, or oyster habitat in particular, is they're sort of the analogy to a coral reef, with a substrate area that then has the living organisms on top. And an oyster reef or an oyster bed is really no different than that. There are often many year classes, so like the adults and the juveniles that are congregated all together, and they form this structured habitat. So we have done project work in Massachusetts and certainly elsewhere and at scale elsewhere, putting shells on the bottom to serve as the base layer, and then planting oysters on top of that to serve as the sort of adding to the population. We've done a bit of bay scallop restoration work as well, but I'm not going to talk about that now. I was mentioning the the specific thought about how a farm, and whether it's a shellfish farm or a seaweed farm, how they interact with the marine environment. And we're sort of testing this idea and hypothesis that if done in the right ways in the right places, that the farm can actually provide benefits to the surrounding environment. And that's a really compelling story. You think about the impact to growing food, and the analogy on land is this concept of regenerative agriculture, like grazing practices that actually increase the soil health in an area, or in this case, growing shellfish, for example, to improve water quality or improve the habitat in the area. And so, the organization as a whole is looking at some of these big questions, like, what farming practices will maximize the benefit? What really are these ecosystem services? I think it's sort of an important term. What can having a farm in a particular location, what can the benefit actually be to the surrounding environment, and where? So here, I'm going to talk about this specific project. This is looking at on land, set up for different cameras that are going down on growing equipment, cages with bags in them filled with oysters, and then the setup for where a camera would go alongside a sort of control area. And so we set up, you can see, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but sort of coming out of the back of the student here who's working on this project is the post where the camera goes. And then, we go through a tide cycle and collect underwater video to document the fish use on the farm. So here's like one of the images from this project. I'm going to sort of keep blowing past this. I do, Jen, I do have a couple of short videos that I could show maybe at the end of the talk or something, and I'm getting there anyway. So one of the other, to sort of wrap that sort of vignette up, where we're interested in understanding how the farms interact with the marine environment, what kind of, and that's from a wanting to know standpoint, but it's ultimately that information can get used by the permit reviewers and the people who are making decisions about where farms will go, or if somebody wants to expand an existing farm, or if somebody, a project proponent for a new area. These farms are all located in an area that is pretty different than how farms are managed on land, which for the most part are owned by private people, and they either rent or own the farmland themselves. And so the sort of regulatory structure and the oversight over this whole practice is extremely regulated, because it's happening in a public space. And I don't know, I'm not going to go deep on that because we could spend a whole course on that. The pandemic has been hugely impactful. Seth will be able to talk more about like real impacts to his farm and others. But there's, basically the pandemic has been crushing for the aquaculture industry in Massachusetts, with maybe a little light at the end of the tunnel coming soon. There's a program that that folks in my organization, along with others, have worked basically to expand some of the work that we were already doing in the habitat restoration side of things. Seeing the surplus of oysters that are on people's farm that they're having a hard time selling, we were able to raise funds, purchase oysters from their farms, and then plant them out on the restoration sites. And so here in Massachusetts, it's been sort of a pilot scale type of project that I think for the participants in the project has been really meaningful. And for those who were not able to participate, it's been challenging, but yeah, I'll move on. So that's another example of a thing that we're working on in space. Something that that is also going on here in Massachusetts is this Shellfish Initiative, and this is a project that really was born out of UMB and Jen and her colleagues that were sort of looking at the way that shellfish broadly is managed in Massachusetts, and sort of a recognition that there was need for that management to be updated. There's just a lot of the world is a rapidly changing place, not only from issues related to climate change, but then the way that shellfish were managed in Massachusetts and really everywhere was as a wild harvest fishery. And the aquaculture industry has grown a lot in Massachusetts and elsewhere. And there are people like me who are interested in adding shellfish to the water to leave them there, who and that's sort of like a new concept in some ways from the shellfish management folks. And so this whole ongoing process, which is actually about to hit a milestone in the next month or so, is been an effort to update management in the state. And so there's a website you ought to take a look at. There's a lot of information on there related to shellfish management in Massachusetts. I think it's Massachusetts or MassShellfishInitiative.org, but you'll find it if you do a search. I can send you guys the slides, just mostly because I have my contact information on here. We do have like a landing page website type thing that you can take a little look at as well. So that's like my rapid fire high level view of like the broad maybe discussion point, like the broad introduction, and then how TNC is thinking about this, and a couple of example projects. So I have like a 3+ minute video that talks mostly about the Habitat Ecosystem Services project, and I have like a 2+ minute video like that's talking about that SOAR project that's supporting oyster aquaculture and restoration project.
I grew up as a little kid out here. I kind of had it in my blood that I just loved being out on the water. I have no doubt that I was put on earth to grow oysters.
Our coastal waters are incredibly valuable for people and nature. Shellfish help our coastal habitats thrive. Historically, in Massachusetts, oysters were abundant in our coastal waters. Through overfishing, destruction of habitat, and disease, we have about 1% of the oysters today that we had when Christopher Columbus sailed. Each individual animal filters about 50 gallons of water a day. Aquaculture is simply growing aquatic plants and animals for the purpose of providing food.
The Nature Conservancy sees aquaculture as a tremendous opportunity, and we're working directly with industry partners, academia, and government to bring science to the table, ensuring that aquaculture is done in a sustainable way now and into the future. If done in the right ways and the right places, shellfish aquaculture can provide sustainable seafood while accelerating the pace of ecosystem recovery.
So our collaboration came about because we have a question globally about how we can use aquaculture to create environmental benefits.
Any farmer will tell you that the farm itself is a source of habitat for other species.
We go out every day, we spend time on the water, we are out among our cages, among our oysters, and so we had a really strong hunch that, in fact, these commercial farms are actually providing much the same habitat that a wild reef would. As an oyster farm, we lack the ability to apply that scientific method. We actually have to bring in research partners to quantify and to do it in a way that is accepted by the broader science community, and that's been a really successful part of working with the Nature Conservancy.
What we're doing is actually capturing underwater video, and that data is then taken and will be analyzed to quantify the habitat value that is being created by the farm.
We've seen a lot of different fish species as well as a lot of crustacean species. We've seen many of the fish using the different types of gear, especially the floating gear.
We're interested not just in how many fish there are and what kinds of fish there are, but we're also really interested in different ways in which the fish are using the aquaculture gear underwater. The Nature Conservancy's interest in sustainable aquaculture aligns well with our research priorities of research to inform management and expansion of sustainable aquaculture in the United States. Regulators and fishery managers who make decisions about aquaculture practices really need robust scientific data to inform their work.
With growing demand for seafood and the need to conserve vulnerable ocean environments, shellfish aquaculture is one way to get us there. This project is just one piece of the puzzle, and that's why we're working with our colleagues around the world on aquaculture. Ultimately, shellfish aquaculture may benefit people and nature. We can use what we learn here in Massachusetts around the globe.
We're really realizing that there's more value than just creating shellfish and jobs. Doing it responsibly, where we can actually go out and prove that it is good for the environment, for the habitat, for biodiversity. It's a win for everyone.
Let's ask if anyone has any questions right now, and then if not, we can see the other piece as well. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a quick question. This is Diane.
Great. And then Ava.
So, yeah. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
So this is, I was excited to hear your lecture this morning because I think it's tying into an area that I'm becoming more interested in. And that is, like you said, I'm a scientist by training and career and moving into aquaculture. And I really keyed into the point that was just made, and that is this need to have robust scientific data to confirm what you're observing with something that could be measured and then used to make decisions. But really, what I'm really wondering is, who is funding the collection of this data, and how efficiently is it now being translated into the people who are looking at permitting or looking at other regulatory or even farming instances? Like, is the data flow fairly efficient to enable decision making, or is the system still being built out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that the information that we have gathered is not at the point of being influential to those decision makers, and So there are specific people that we are interested in influencing, and there are sort of like two tiers of it. So the first is in thinking about some of the permitting that you need to get for a farm would require an Army Corps permit, and the National Marine Fisheries Service has an opportunity to comment to the Army Corps on the issuance of a permit for somebody wanting to start or expand a farm. Part of the environmental safeguards that are in place for development in this area is to make sure that other activities or other impacts are not going to be detrimental to a whole host of things. One of those things is valuable, existing valuable habitats. So we know that eelgrass is important for a whole host of reasons, and so you can't. The system is designed such that development isn't going to impact those habitats that are important mostly for regulated species. And so an example of sort of putting that on the ground is you can't or you would not get a permit for an oyster farm and propose that you are going to put your cages on top of an eelgrass bed. So the way the review goes for a project like that is, that you sort of have to find the places in the marine environment where none of that other habitat is located, or where you'll have minimal impact. So one of the things that we're interested in understanding and ultimately feeding up to those people are, is the impact of maybe a floating cage nearby to an eelgrass bed a negative, neutral, or positive? And where's the data that says, I think it's sort of intuitive, like you shouldn't put something on top of eelgrass or it will likely not survive. But there probably aren't robust studies that support that. I'm not suggesting that we should advocate for that. What I'm suggesting is that we want to understand the impacts so that the review process could potentially and sort of shift the mindset of like, anything you do in the water is going to be bad. And so that will be the framework under any project review. When in fact, the hypothesis is that in some cases, the farm actually is a net benefit. And perhaps a farm should be sited somewhere where there is some valuable habitat, but where the habitat may be enhanced. And so, who we're going for is basically NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service and those that regulate and review projects from the standpoint of essential fish habitat, which is like an official term. So there's that. I think the other piece is that, there's a whole host of reasons why aquaculture development has been relatively slow in the US. And I think that, when you're thinking about apple orchard or a corn farm, what that looks like. There's either a red barn in your brain, or there's, apple blossoms and apples on the ground in your brain. When you talk about an aquaculture farm, most people don't know what you're talking about. And so I think generally a sort of side benefit or a side intentional component of this project is to like develop or bring some compelling images to what a farm looks like and raise the education level of not only mostly the general public who regulators in essence should be representing, but so that's sort of like a side benefit. that's a way long answer to like one part of your question. The other one was like, is the information flowing? Not yet. We're like a couple years into the study. We have one more year of data collection to do before it gets like fully analyzed, ultimately gets written into, you know, a journal article, and I think that becomes sort of like the gold standard for something that a regulator can refer to. But in the meantime, we're feeding this information up to those people now, sort of informally. It's kind of a windy answer, I guess. Another question, or
I think Ava had a question.
Yes, thanks so much, Jennifer. Hi, Steve. Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. Looks like you do tremendously valuable work over there. I had a question a bit broad just about your organization. I was wondering if you're really focused on research specifically, so research to support sustainability, or if it's a little bit broader and research is just part of the work you do to support farms, but you also support existing farms, for instance, with implementing best practices. And the reason why I'm wondering, it's also relating to the example you gave earlier about the ability of aquaculture to help restore ecosystems. And they're wondering then if you're currently working on getting more evidence on the benefits of restorative ocean farming, or if this is like one of the objectives you have, you know, in your specific region as an organization, and you're supporting farms there, or you're maybe even setting up farms to promote this type of farming.
Yeah, I think you know, the Nature Conservancy, we're sort of self-proclaimed science-driven organization, and so I think the underpinning of anything that we work on has to be founded in science, and I think that's in part why some of our early work here in Massachusetts in this space is on primary research. You know, I'll sort of like tip my hand a little bit. I think that this is important information for us and others to know, but it's also like it is a good entry point for our organization into this space. You know, we're approaching this objectively, and not from the perspective of saying aquaculture is bad, we shouldn't have it. And I think it would be a little bit disingenuous to say like we need more all the time. And so understanding how farms interact with the marine environment, I think, is the appropriate approach for us. And the other part of that is that there are it will help inform how we develop our program going forward. And you know, so I'm giving you a bit of a snapshot of what we're doing in Massachusetts, which is relatively small to the organization's sort of portfolio overall. You know, a couple of other sort of spaces we're working in. One, you know, there's a really robust, big industry overseas, and in the U.S., it's, you know, we're incredibly small producers in many ways. We're working, you know, with seaweed farmers in Indonesia, and you know, doing some work in Belize around certain seaweed species, and looking at production methods and trying to identify best practices that the farmers can use. But also, you know, when we're working overseas, there's a big focus on the governance and working with regulating entities overseas, which we're doing here as well, you know, to some degree.
Steve, just so you know, people in my class are from all over the place, and Ava in particular is in the Netherlands. She works for the Ava
Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. So then, you know, I'm like giving you survey level information for, you're an expert in your own right,
Oh, I definitely wouldn't call myself an expert, but no.
But another quick example of like something we're working on is sort of is like a recognition that that there will be development of aquaculture in the future globally. It's happening, and it's happening at a fairly rapid pace. And so one of the ways that we are interested as an organization in intersecting with that as an underlying sort of assumption is the recognition that that it's also risky business, and the there's a need to steer capital. It's a capital intensive business to steer capital toward good actors. And so, there are others that are sort of working on the back end in sort of like the seafood watch kind of space, like certification type program. And we're taking a slightly different approach to say, identifying companies, specific companies or sectors more broadly that are going to be able to maximize those environmental benefits, or they're going to be cited well, they're going to follow best practices, and that we could potentially marry investors with those businesses so that the trajectory of that development is deflected towards sustainability in a sort of broad stroke. But that's, I don't spend most of my day at that scale level thinking. It's more what we're doing here in Massachusetts.
Great, thanks a lot for that answer. Thanks.
Then I'd like to make a comment just in general.
Great.
First off, Steve, thank you so much. I remember the first day meeting you at a meeting, I think at the Coalition for Buzzards Bay, and you were getting beat up over your concept of these oyster reefs. Is that 10 years ago, maybe?
Probably about now, yeah.
And the fact that your organization, because of the clout and the energy and the history that your organization has in proper land management over, decades, has been fantastic. And, you had a vision and an idea. You obviously had to convince your board to partially fund you to look at the whole oyster reef ideas, and especially with, basically putting back what was here before we showed up in North America. So there's that important aspect of what you're doing. And the fact that you have researchers out there, you've teamed up with different universities, you are collecting the data, you are building, basically from what Eva was just mentioning, how you're documenting this and proving this. But the other thing that's really key, and you started to mention this, is the fact that because of your organization and the teamwork that you've created, we are having the ability to change the decision makers' view of aquaculture, especially in and around the East Coast, especially, and you briefly touched on it again, of other countries, whether it's a cultural thing or the need to use the oceans, the intertidal zones, the mangroves to grow, seafood. It's a fundamental shift in Americans' way of using it. The fact that we have to compete with people who want to go out and paddleboard or windsurf in these areas as compared to growing sustainable seafood, that's going to take another 10 years. It's comparable to when we were all introduced to seatbelts back in the 1960s. I think it took the auto industry 15 years before people actually wanted to do it. But because of your organization, your direction and energies, we are making a difference. And it's very exciting because the groundwork that we're creating now is going to make aquaculture, at least on the East Coast, West Coast, much easier to do. But we still have the fight to fight. So anyway, thanks for all of the work you do.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think the one little nugget in there, I sort of have in the back of my head that the Google Maps view of pick your your nearby harbor in Massachusetts and look at the development of that harbor with however many hundreds of moorings, for example, are in there, or the shoreline that is studded with either private or public docks. I mean, the idea that our coastal area is like an undeveloped area, I think is not true. And we have already, as a society, decided in many ways what is important to us. And I think bringing aquaculture higher up the pecking order is I think is a worthwhile endeavor.
And then along those lines, and it's relatively new, probably in the last 5 to 10 years, is this whole idea of the nitrogen loading due to the abuse of the land, and the fact that oyster reefs and the seaweed futures can potentially turn that around. But also all of the biodiversity added benefits that your diagrams were showing is just fantastic. And Diane actually took a challenge pill, and she came out to the oyster farm last week. So she saw all the biodiversity in our nets, because we're all subtitle, as you know, Steve. And we've got our little pond, and I can actually, one of the things I would love to do is to get a research person down there to really quantify all of the biodiversity, the number of critters. And one of the benefits that we notice is that the light tackle fly fishermen all love to fish on an outgoing tide in our inlet in our pond, because the striped bass and the bluefish all feed on the fish that are getting dragged out of our pond.
Yeah.
But the fish are there because of our oyster farm. So kind of fun.
Does anyone else have any questions while we have Steve on the call?
I could, if you want, Jen, I can show this other short video that's sort of related about this other project, and mostly as a COVID relief kind of effort. Give me a thumbs up.
The thing about the ocean is it doesn't make anything easy. Everything out here is difficult. I mean, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on all of us. The restaurant business has taken a tremendous hit. And unfortunately, we are tied at the hip to the restaurant business. No restaurants, no oysters.
And a lot of the industries, they just don't go fishing. They can't sell the lobster, so you don't go. But we have to keep the oysters moving. We got to keep them clean, keep them separated, and sort them out. So it really hasn't changed, other than we don't have any place to sell them.
Our last sales of oysters were the 13th of March. And since then, we haven't sold any at all.
In Massachusetts, sales are down 55%.
We went from selling 5,000 a week to nothing.
10 million oysters are sitting on farms.
We're going to fall short by probably 500,000 oysters.
$5 million has been dedicated to the Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration Program, which will touch down across the East Coast as well as in Washington State. It's really a simple concept. The Nature Conservancy, along with partners at the Pew Charitable Trusts, are purchasing oysters from farmers that have been hit hard by the pandemic, and we're planting those oysters on restoration sites where oysters can do their good work of filtering water and providing habitat for other fish and other species.
Today we put out 2,200 count bags, which was 22,800 and some odd oysters.
We dumped them out on the deck, counted them, measured them, and we'll be able to use that information when we come back to do some monitoring a year from now.
We sprinkle those oysters all over the reef, and hopefully that's going to build the reef up to where they start to propagate and build up the oyster stock and clean the water. It's a win-win for both the farmers and the ecosystem.
We need these businesses to survive because they are providing services to the coastal waters that we need. And if they go out of business, the environment will suffer.
Thank you very much to the Conservancy. All the growers that can do this are going to thank you. Hopefully this will all end soon and we'll all be back to normal. But I think going forward, the biggest thing is, try to support your land farmers and your ocean farmers.
I'm glad you showed that. That was terrific, actually. It's great. Thank you.
that program is ongoing and was sort of like was born out of an effort that was led by, people like Bob Rowe at the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, people in my office, folks at Pew, NOAA, to try and lobby and get federal funding through COVID relief early on to the aquaculture industry that basically didn't materialize. And so we were fortunate enough to have through those efforts, basically have a really good project scoped, and we were able to source private funding to support this effort in a sort of one-off type setup. But it is going to, and the intention is that it's going to serve as a model that, we can serve up to the feds to sort of build programming like this at the state level, and whether that's through funding through USDA is probably the likely funder, and sort of try to marry the restoration idea with the people who are best at growing shellfish and the growers. So that's like, there's a lot on the table there.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions today? Yes, Rosie.
Just one question. What is the status of this seaweed industry post-COVID, or in the end of COVID, hopefully?
Yeah, and in the U.S., the seaweed industry is like nascent at best. There are very few people who grow it commercially and have a market for it, and so it's sort of the industry as a whole in the U.S., certainly in the Northeast, is sort of in its infancy, and it's in many ways, like, even the regulating community doesn't know how to deal with it. Like, is it a seafood product? Is it a agricultural commodity? Those are totally different, regulatory streams. And I think the challenge has been that it hasn't become a moneymaker yet. It's like, it's still sort of R&D and figuring out how to do it. And then the infrastructure to do it at any version of scale and then send it to the dump to become fertilizer doesn't make economic sense. And so it's like, what do we do? And, so it's not a staple in the US diet, but it is elsewhere. And, so from our perspective as the Nature Conservancy, I think that there's a lot of opportunity in, similar to shellfish, the benefits to the environment, I think, are potentially real. There are water quality implications, there are habitat implications, and I sort of hold those two things as the sort of primary drivers we're interested in the shellfish world here in Massachusetts. And so I think that there's reason to be thinking about and working on it. But there are a whole host of challenges. The market is, I think, the driver, and then I think soon behind that is the potential for, more stuff in the water, and where you start getting into protected species and whales and challenges from endangered species.
Diane, do you have a question?
I do, yes. So when you're talking about the restoration efforts, who are the users driving this? Is it mainly city municipalities or property owners, community owners, or is it more industry recovery, or how much of it is the aquaculture industry?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if you come right into Massachusetts, it's like, who is who's driving, for these projects? It's like me, the municipalities are the people who like are the actual permit holders, like they are the project proponents, but there's actually very little demand from that sector for this type of project work. I think, there's just such a long history of, that's happening at the same time as many towns have, really invested a lot in shellfish management, and some towns, are growing millions and millions of shellfish, and they're going into their municipal waters, and that is all happening sort of as an artifact and as the reality of what people want, that they're building up the population so that people can go out and harvest them. The concept is that shellfish shellfish are sort of are owned by the residents of the Commonwealth, and they are there for our benefit, and that benefit is realized on their harvest. And it's I think a sort of paradigm shift to think about their role in the ecosystem and the benefits that they could provide by staying in the ecosystem. I am not against harvesting shellfish. But I think that it's an interesting sort of overlay of history that is transitioning to now. So like I have been part of restoration projects, and we have planted shellfish on those restoration projects, and the authority in which I was allowed to do that was through the town and their authority to plant shellfish to enhance the population so that people could harvest them. It's sort of like sort of backing into it. There are other places like in the Chesapeake or the southeastern US that have really sort of bought into the idea and have done restoration project work beyond sort of demonstration scale, and that's just again, so I think sort of an artifact of where we are.
We're coming up on an hour, so just want to thank Steve for his time. If anyone else has any questions, feel free now. Otherwise, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to do it. You guys have my, send those things around. You have my contact information. Glad to chat whenever.